Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, screenwriter and mystery author Roger Simon talks about his book, Blacklisting Myself, Memoir of a Hollywood Apostate in the Age of Terror. Mr. Simon discusses his personal journey from left-wing Hollywood hippie to becoming the right-wing founder of Pajamas Media. He discusses his book with political columnist and commentator Armstrong Williams.
I'm Armstrong Williams. This is Afterwards Book TV. Our guest today is Roger L. Simon and his book, Blacklisting Myself. Blacklisting myself sounds as though your blacklisting was self-imposed.
Well, in a way it is, in a way it isn't. I mean, it's meant a little ironically. Yeah, I mean, as I shifted somewhat to the right in my politics, the Hollywood community went like this a bit with me, but I went a bit this way myself. So it is self-imposed to a large degree, although it doesn't mean I don't want to make movies or things like that. I do. But when I said blacklisting myself, it was a way of saying, I'm going to tell you what I really think, and you do what you want with it.
Why is blacklisting necessary? Why does it exist?
Well, of course, it shouldn't exist. I mean, it's an old, thing of the 50s and 40s when there was a blacklist against the left, and now in Hollywood, there's something of an unwritten blacklist against the right. Neither are good.
Where did you grow up?
Where?
Yes.
New York City.
Both parents in the household?
Mm-hmm.
Sisters and brothers?
I have two younger sisters.
What did your parents do for a living?
My father was a doctor, a radiologist. I write about him a bit in the book. He was involved with the Atomic Energy Commission in the early days of radiation. So when I was a 7-year-old kid, the family legend was that in case of nuclear attack, he would become the governor of New York. Of course, that was a big exaggeration, but it was something I lived with.
And your mother?
My mother was basically a housewife, but she started out in public relations for a little while, wanted to be a writer, and then was a housewife.
What were the politics in the household?
Basically Stevenson Democrats, as we used to call it, traditional liberal Democrats, except that I think my father, there were other threads, but I was too young to know about it, and I rebelled against him. I went to the left in high school. I mean, really, literally when I was about 14, I started going to the left, as a lot of people in my generation did.
Define going to the left.
Oh, well, that's a tough question because, it was such an emotional and kind of slightly show-offy kind of thing. At that point, my father, who was working for the Atomic Energy Commission, it meant for me being for a group called Sane Nuclear Policy, which means no nukes and kind of, and what are you doing, Dad? At the first. And then also, those were the days when the civil rights movement was really revving up. So the other rebellion against my father was, looking back, just childish. However, the civil rights movement was by no means childish. And a lot of us, Jewish white boys in New York at that period, wanted to get involved with that for a good reason, I think.
Well, speaking of the civil rights movement, in the beginning of your book, you're in South Carolina, right. Sumter, Myrtle Beach. It's near where I grew up in Marion. And you're driving, you're headed to a rally, something that's very important to you. Something happens to your vehicle, you have a flat, you stop. An old Southern cop wants to help. He looks inside your car and there's a young black kid. What happens?
Well, what happened was that just as the cop was about to help me change this tire, and and it was, that kind of situation, he said, "What's that boy doing in your car?" in Southernese, and threw the jack at my feet. I started to feel shaky, and I started with the jack, and then the car came down in my hand, and I've lived with this the rest of my life. But what's the interesting irony in it is that people treated me like a hero of the civil rights movement when I came home. But I was and I wasn't. I mean, I was, also a guy who misused his jack. So I was both things at once.
You knew Goodman, who was killed a year earlier than that incident you're speaking about.
Andy Goodman was my best friend in kindergarten. That's how I knew him. So his shadow was over everything those years. I mean, the Mississippi burning story was so powerful to us. And to have had a childhood friend, shot to death, meant something and made things scary.
How did his death impact your life and your purpose?
I think that I had that purpose anyway that point in my life. I wanted to participate in the civil rights movement because it was the great cause of those days. I think it was a great thing. And I think that I just happened to have known him and only added to it. But it added a flavor of, this is for real, because somebody died that I knew intimately. So that made it different in that level, but it didn't make my impetus to do it different.
Did it concern you that you could possibly die during that time, especially in the Deep South?
Yeah, I was aware of that possibility, but remember, I was 21. And one of the things one can say about 21-year-olds is they don't really think they're going to die. Right now, I'm very aware I'm going to die. But age 21, even though Andy Goodman died, part of me said, that couldn't happen, even though he took a bullet.
Why was the written word your escape, your platform? Where did you get that? Where did you get that from? And how did it get you inside the walls of Hollywood?
Well, everybody in my family wanted to be the writer, and I was the only one who went out and did it. So I think ever since I was a kid, I wanted to write, and I started writing very young, and I still write now, and I can't not write. So what happened is that same summer in Sumter, South Carolina, I was living in the home of the black funeral director in the town, who you probably know were big figures in those towns.
Still
are, but in those days they were the community leaders. And he was actually a cousin of Martin Luther King. And every night I would go work on my first novel, because in the air-conditioned funeral home, because it was the only air conditioning around in those days, because they had to keep from the bodies from stinking up. And I wrote this novel called Air, which happened to have been based on a real story of a guy I went to Dartmouth with who killed his girlfriend with an overdose of heroin. So it was a very macabre story. And I wrote it in a funeral home in the South, and it got published. And everybody in my graduate school class was green with envy. I even envied myself. And the novel was read by Hollywood people who liked the dialogue. And I went to Hollywood. I mean, in those days, those things could happen. They don't happen much now. But in those days, there was more interest in good writing in Hollywood, I think. And they read the book, and they thought the dialogue was good. And I loved the movies, so hey, here I come. And that's how I got there.
What about some of the figures that you had a chance to associate with? Frank Sinatra, some of the big names, some of the directors, some of the people that shaped Hollywood that you had a chance to, Paul Newman, that you had a chance to be up and close with, and the impact, and just being on the inside. Talk about that.
Well, I think there were different eras. And when I arrived in Hollywood, which was really 68, 9, in that period, the old Hollywood was still in the air. And it was a much more interesting time because it was a different tradition entirely, even though the world of What Makes Sammy Run was true and there were venal executives and all that kind of stuff. There was more respect for writing and more respect for the art of film. It was curious. The studios seemed to want to make better movies. Then it drifted away. I mean, I got to meet people early on like Warren Beatty who were really good filmmakers. Later on now, as I made a drift to the right, I mean, I'm alienated from them to some extent, but not all of them.
What started, you bring this up, I want to get into this a little later. What piqued your curiosity that maybe you were not as liberal or as at home as you thought you were?
Well, it was the O.J. trial, really. But let me roll back a second before I get into that.
Yeah.
Because I was more than liberal. I wanted to be a radical.
You were a radical.
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit of a parlor radical. I mean, I wasn't, I certainly wasn't William Ayers or anything close to it. But I knew those people, and some of the time, at least, I thought they might have some truth. Now I don't think they have any. Now, coming back to your question of the change, we're in L.A. in the 90s in the time of the O.J. trial. the city is transfixed by this trial.
Held hostage.
What?
Held hostage.